I don't know if you've ever thought about this, but as you look at history, there are outstanding examples of people who exhibited some skill or ability, or maybe some character trait to such an extent that their name almost becomes synonymous with that trait or that characteristic. You have the honest Abes of history, right? And as we look at the Bible, we find that Paul, the Apostle Paul, points to Abraham as an outstanding example of one who had faith in God, one who trusted God and trusted in his promises. On a more negative side of things, you could look at someone like Judas Iscariot, who is an outstanding example of a backstabbing betrayer, one who betrayed a close friend who trusted in him. Last week, as we were making our way through First John, we came to a portion of First John where we looked at Cain and Abel. And Cain, of course, is a great example of exactly what we should not be, how we should not interact with our brothers and sisters. He was an outstanding example of one who hated his brother and of a murderer. As we come to this next section in First John, we're going to see the opposite type of example. We're going to see John point not to an outstanding example of hatred and murder, but the most outstanding example, the supreme example of what true love looks like. He points to Christ as that perfect example. Another passage comes to mind from the Apostle Paul in the book of Romans, where he does something very similar, but with a different emphasis. You all know this passage, no doubt, Romans 5, 6 through 8. For when we were still without strength, in due time Christ died for the ungodly. For scarcely for a righteous man will one die, yet perhaps for a good man someone would even dare to die. But God demonstrates his own love toward us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. So his emphasis there is on the magnitude of God's love. God loves us so much that even when we were rebellious, blasphemous sinners who hated him, who rejected the gospel, Christ died for us. And in our text this morning, John's going to highlight Jesus' sacrificial love for us in laying down his life through crucifixion. He's going to point to that as the greatest demonstration of love, an event that reveals true love and what true love looks like. And as we move through this passage, you'll see this on your outline if you got one. This section points to three truths about the love command. First, it's going to present Jesus as the archetype of the love command. In other words, the perfect model. The perfect model of what love looks like and the pattern of true love. It highlights the practical fulfillment of the love command, and it points to the confidence that we can gain from fulfilling the love command. We're in 1 John 3, and we'll be looking at verses 16 through 20 this morning. So let's begin by reading those verses together. By this we have come to know love, because he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for the brothers. But whoever has worldly goods and sees his brother having need and shuts his heart from him, how does the love of God remain in him? My little children, let us not love with a word nor with the tongue, but in action and in truth. And by this we know that we are of the truth and will persuade our hearts before him. Because if the heart condemns us, we know that God is greater than our hearts and knows all things. In verse 16, John points to the one supreme example that reveals what perfect love looks like. He says, By this we know, or we have come to know. He uses a perfect tense verb there in the Greek, the idea being that at some point in the past we have come to know, and as a result we presently know. By this we have come to know love. By this points forward to the because clause in that verse. As we've studied 1 John, we've seen this sentence structure before, haven't we? John's highlighting something by drawing attention to it just before he introduces it. When he uses a phrase like, by this we know, what's he doing? He's immediately focusing our attention, just like that strange noise just caused you to focus your attention. By this, beep, by this we know, he's focusing our attention on what he's about to say. We know what true, pure love looks like because Jesus laid down his life for us. Jesus willingly, freely, gladly laid down his life and died through an incredibly painful and shameful death by crucifixion. And he did it for us. John 10 immediately comes to mind for those who are familiar with that passage. In John 10, where he speaks of himself as the good shepherd, in John 10:11, Jesus says, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd gives his life for the sheep. Then down in verses 15 through 18, Jesus continues, as the Father knows me, even so I know the Father. And I lay down my life for the sheep. And other sheep I have which are not of this fold. Them also I must bring, and they will hear my voice. And there will be one flock and one shepherd. Therefore my Father loves me, because I lay down my life that I may take it again. No one takes it from me, but I lay it down of myself. I have power to lay it down, and I have power to take it again. This command I have received from my Father. Jesus laid down his life for the sheep, this verse says. The statement uses a preposition, the preposition huper, translated for there. And that could express either advantage or substitution. It could mean that Jesus died for the advantage of the sheep. Or it could also mean Jesus died as the substitute for the sheep, instead of the sheep. Most likely both ideas are included here. Jesus' death was vicarious substitution. He suffered the wrath of God in our place, taking the due penalty for our sins upon himself as our substitute instead of the sheep. And this was, of course, very much to the advantage of the sheep. So most likely both ideas are included there. For the advantage of the sheep, he steps in, he takes our place, he bears the penalty, he dies as our substitute in our place. In John 13, during the Last Supper, after Jesus has washed his disciples' feet, Judas has departed to betray Jesus, and Jesus has this really interesting exchange with Peter. Look at verse 31. So when Judas had gone out, Jesus said, now the Son of Man is glorified, and God is glorified in him. If God is glorified in him, God will also glorify him in himself and glorify him immediately. Little children, I shall be with you a little while longer. You will seek me, and as I said to the Jews, where I am going, you cannot come. So now I say to you, and a new commandment I give to you, that you love one another, as I have loved you, that you also love one another. By this all will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another. Now look at verse 36. Simon Peter said to him, Lord, where are you going? He's not really asking where he's going. He's not so much asking for information as much as he is requesting, Lord, let me go with you. And Jesus answers him as such. Look at what he says. Jesus answered him, "Where I am going, you cannot follow me now, but you shall follow me afterward." Peter said to him, "Lord, why can I not follow you now?" And notice this next statement: "I will lay down my life for your sake." Peter's words repeat the words of Jesus from John 10. Jesus said, as the good shepherd, that he would lay down his life as a substitute for the sheep, in place of the sheep. Peter reverses the role. And through his misguided zeal, he says that he will lay down his life, if necessary, in place of Jesus. Remember, this is the same apostle who later that night tries to kill one of the men that come to arrest Jesus. He misses, he cuts off his ear. Jesus heals the man. Jesus answered in verse 38, Jesus answered him, "Will you lay down your life for my sake? Most assuredly, I say to you, the rooster shall not crow until you have denied me 3 times. Now, Jesus here is not only pointing to Peter's failure in devotion. He's not simply saying your commitment, your devotion will crumble in the face of possible harm and death. He's saying something beyond that here. Notice what he says. He repeats what Peter had said, but he repeats it as a question. And he uses an emphatic form for my. In Greek, when you have a pronoun like this, you can simply add one letter and it changes it from the normal form to an emphatic form. And that's what he uses here. He's saying, will you lay down your life for me? No, Jesus will. And Jesus must lay down his life for Peter. Jesus has to die. He has to fulfill this role. Peter has already said things to him. "No, Lord, you don't have to do that." And he says, "Get behind me, Satan." You remember that incident? Here, it's something similar. He's saying, "I will give my life for you if necessary." He is trying to divert Jesus from laying down his life. Jesus has to do it, and no one else can do it for him. No one else can do it in his place. Only he can do it. But Jesus does, later that same night in chapter 15, he does lay out what he does in laying down his life as an example for us to follow. Not in that it is somehow salvific, not in that somehow we are taking the place for or adding to or anything like that, but in the sense that he is the example of that kind of love. In other words, the degree or the extent to which he loves, we are to follow him in that. John 15, 12 through 13. "This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, than to lay down one's life for his friends." And this is what John has in mind in 1 John 3:16. He laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for the brothers. In both Jesus' statement in John 15 and in John's statement here, the principle is articulated in general terms. It doesn't give us the specifics in terms of how it is stated here, but it can be applied to very specific situations, and that's exactly what John is about to do. It's also what some of the other authors in the New Testament do. One very obvious example would be what Paul does in Ephesians 5. In Ephesians 5, 1 and 2, he gives us the general principle. He says, "Therefore be imitators of God as dear children." You ever noticed how little children imitate their parents? He's saying that's how we should be with God. Imitate how God is and walk in love, as Christ also has loved us and given himself for us, an offering and a sacrifice to God for a sweet-smelling aroma. So in general terms, Paul says, we as Christians should exhibit the kind of love, the kind of sacrificial love that Jesus demonstrated. We should walk in love, just as he did. Then down in verses 24, beginning in verse 22, rather. In verse 22 of that chapter, he starts to talk about husbands and wives. In verses 22 to 24, Paul exhorts wives to submit to their own husbands. And then beginning in verse 25, Paul offers a very specific application of the command to love as Christ has loved us. He applies this to husbands and how they should love their wives. Notice what he says. Husbands, love your wives just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for her. That is a tall order. For those of you who are husbands, you are to love your wife the way Christ loved the church. Christ died the most painful, horrible death possible for the good of the church. And we are to love our wives like that. That he might sanctify and cleanse her with the washing of water by the word, that he might present her to himself a glorious church, not having spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that she should be holy and without blemish. Verse 28, so husbands ought to love their own wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself, for no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as the Lord does the church. For we are members of his body, of his flesh, and of his bones. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This is a great mystery, but I speak concerning Christ and the church. Nevertheless, let each one of you in particular so love his own wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. So a husband should love, nourish, cherish, protect, provide for his wife, taking care of her in the same way that he would take care of his own body. Loving her with the same kind of self-sacrificial love that Christ has demonstrated in his care for the church. That's how Paul takes this very specific command and says, okay, in the context of marriage, husbands, this is how you are to treat your wives. In our passage in 1 John, he's going to do something very different with a very different context. John states the general principle. We should lay down our lives for the brothers, for the brethren, for the brothers and the sisters, fellow believers. That's what he's talking about there. And then he applies this to a very specific area of concern. Look at what he says in verse 17. But whoever has worldly goods and sees his brother have a need and shuts his heart from him, how does the love of God remain in him? Notice how the verse starts. But whoever. John is drawing a contrast here. A contrast between how we ought to love one another, laying down our lives as Christ did, and how we could instead choose a more selfish, a more self-serving response that maybe pretends to love but doesn't really. The phrase that he uses there, worldly goods, uses a word for the resources needed to maintain life. The means of subsistence is the idea there, the word for goods. It's actually the same word that he used back in chapter 2. You remember when he exhorts us, don't love the world or the things in the world. He uses this word there. It's back in chapter 2, verses 15 through 17 that he has that admonition to not love the world or the things in the world. And one of the things in the world, depending on what translation you're looking at, it's the pride of life. Or a better translation, I think, is the pride in possessions. But that word for life or possessions has some range to it in terms of what it means, but I think what he's getting at there is that an abundance of material resources can lead to pride in that wealth and trust in that wealth and a love for those things instead of a love for and a trust in God. That's what he was getting at back in chapter 2 and verse 16. Here in chapter 3, he's saying that if you have any excess beyond what's necessary to sustain your own life, if you have resources and you see your brother in need and you choose not to assist him, well, what does that say about you? And John doesn't use the Greek word for riches. There is a Greek word, just like in English, that means riches. He doesn't use that word. He simply uses a word that means resources, resources for living. He's not only addressing rich people. And in our context, we need to remind ourselves what that means. Perhaps no one in this room thinks of themselves as rich, but comparatively to much of the world, virtually everyone around us would be considered rich. But in any case, he doesn't use the word for riches. He is simply saying if you have the resources necessary to sustain life, and you see someone who lacks those resources, and you say, I think I won't. God bless you, but I need to keep some for myself. John sets up here a generic subject, a type of person, a category of people. He says, whoever. He doesn't have one specific individual in view. He's saying anybody, whoever has worldly goods, sees the need, and chooses not to respond. That's the idea. The phrase shuts his heart, in the translation I've given you there, literally says closes or shuts his entrails or his intestines. That's where we get this really almost comical now translation in the King James Version. Some of you know it. It says, shutteth up his bowels of compassion. Very strange contemporary meaning when you say something like that. But the figurative use of this word referred to the seat of emotions. It's much like how we would use the word heart. So heart is a good translation here. And the word, it can refer to the feeling itself. When it's used in the plural, as it is here, it can mean love or affection. So we draw all of that information together. What we get is that the idiom here means to refuse to show compassion. You see the need, but you shut your heart. You refuse to show compassion. The idea is that you have the means, you see the need, and you don't respond in love. You don't meet the need. Well, then how does the love of God remain in a person like that? And obviously, John anticipates a negative answer to this rhetorical question. The love of God does not reside in that kind of person. Now, you may remember from discussing this phrase before that the phrase love of God is somewhat ambiguous. It can either mean God's love for us or it can mean our love for God. And here I think it clearly means our love for God. If we truly love God, well, how can we at the same time fail to respond in love to brothers and sisters in Christ who are in need and we don't help them? If you compare 1 John 5, 1 and 2, you have a similar idea of loving God and loving other believers being two sides of the same coin. Whoever believes that Jesus is the Christ is born or begotten of God. And everyone who loves him who begot also loves him who is begotten of him. It's just another way of saying if you love God, you will love other believers who are also begotten of God. By this we know that we love the children of God, when we love God and keep his commandments. There's also an Old Testament background to this idea. If you look in the book of Deuteronomy, the law of Moses addresses a similar situation in Deuteronomy 15. verses 7 through 11. If there is among you a poor man of your brethren, within any of the gates in your land which the Lord your God is giving you, you shall not harden your heart nor shut your hand from your poor brother. But you shall open your hand wide to him and willingly lend him sufficient for his need. Whatever he needs, beware lest there be a wicked thought in your heart, saying, the seventh year, the year of Jubilee, is at hand. In other words, the year when debts would be forgiven. If I give it to him, it won't be long, and he'll be forgiven the debt, and I won't get my money back. And your eye be evil against your poor brother, and you give him nothing. And he cry out to the Lord against you, and it becomes sin among you. You shall surely give to him, and your heart should not be grieved when you give to him. Because for this thing the Lord your God will bless you in all your works, and in all to which you put your hand. For the poor will never cease from the land. Therefore I command you, saying, you shall open your hand wide to your brother, to your poor and your needy in your land. That's the same kind of idea that John is here addressing. In verse 18 of our passage, John directly addresses his audience as my little children. And then he exhorts them, let us not love with a word nor with the tongue. In other words, not with mere lip service, not with empty words, but in action and in truth. Real love in demonstration. Look at verse 19. And by this we know that we are of the truth and will persuade our hearts before him. John likes this phrase, by this we know that. It often points forward to highlight what he's about to say, just as it did back in verse 16. We just saw that a few moments ago. But here it doesn't point forward, it points back. By this we know points back to the previous verse. By demonstrating real love, not through mere words, but through our actions, by truly exhibiting love for fellow believers, by that we know that we're of the truth. And when he mentions being of the truth, he means essentially the same thing as being of God. But here, John uses the variation of that phrase simply because look at the end of the last verse. The previous verse just ended with the word truth, so he gives us a variation, not of God, but of the truth. But he's referring to essentially the same thing. So again, as back in verse 14, fulfilling the love command, this time in a very concrete and a tangible way, by fulfilling the love command in that kind of tangible and concrete way, well, that provides assurance that we are of the truth, that we really are of God, that we are true children of God. Because again, as that previous chapter was fleshing out for us, how do we know that? Well, the characteristics of our life. Is God really moving in your life? If you're really regenerate, if you're really a child of God, how can you possibly not exhibit love? Because that's a core characteristic of who God is. Knowing that we're of the truth and persuading our hearts before him in this verse are parallel ideas. To persuade or to convince our hearts is just an idiomatic way of saying, as it's defined in Low-and-Nidus lexicon, they say it means to exhibit confidence and assurance in a situation which might otherwise cause dismay or fear. To be confident, to be assured. So the verse is telling us that practical fulfillment of the love command results in knowing that we are of the truth. And it results in being confident in God's presence. And that brings us to verse 20. Verse 20 is widely regarded as the hardest verse to interpret in all of 1 John. Trying to translate it is difficult because of the way the Greek syntax is. Trying to relate it to the verse before, how does this How does this relate to verse 19? It obviously points back to it, but in what way does it relate to it? Both of those things are difficult. You can see it if you compare English translations, because you will get a different meaning in different translations. Some of them drop one of the words. Some of them supply a verb. One commentary that I looked at listed 10 different interpretations of this. Now, some of these I had a very difficult time even understanding how the person coming up with it thought that was what the verses said, and some of them I had a difficult time understanding how they even thought that it was a coherent explanation of what John might be saying. Basically, the syntax of the Greek sentence is difficult. And the reason for that is partly because there's this word, we referred to it, I don't know, I think maybe it was last week, but there's this word that can be translated either as that or because. And it depends on the context. And here you can make an argument for both, and it occurs in two parts of the verse. So if we just give a literal translation where we're trying to kind of show what's there and the possibility of translation, it would be something like this. That, or because, if the heart condemns us, that, or because, God is greater than our hearts. So it's not too difficult to see how you come to this verse and people who can read the Greek text say, I don't understand what in the world John might be saying here. On top of that, most modern commentators think that this is supposed to be a reassuring statement. God knows our hearts, and he's greater than our hearts. Is supposed to be a reassuring statement. But many interpreters throughout church history actually thought it was the opposite. They thought that this was a stern warning, a very strict warning. Now, all of that preliminary explanation is simply to say, I'm going to tell you how I think the verse should be translated and what I think it means, but I also want you to understand the difficulty of this verse and understand what I'm doing and how I got there, or at least something of it. So here's how I think it should be translated, and then I'll tell you how I think it should be interpreted. Verse 20, because, so I've translated it because, not that, because if the heart condemns us, and I think John expects us to supply the verb we know. Because if the heart condemns us, we know that God is greater than our hearts and knows all things. John has just pointed to the practical fulfillment of the love command, practical demonstrations of love as the means by which we can know that we're of the truth and we can reassure our hearts before God. We can have confidence before God. And here in verse 20, he explains why it's necessary to persuade our hearts before God. It's necessary to persuade our hearts before God by looking at our lives and saying, yes, I am actually loving people in demonstration. It's necessary to persuade our hearts and have confidence from that, because if our heart, our own conscience, condemns us for our failure to love, how much more will God do so? God is greater than our conscience in that he knows all things. He knows beyond your guilty conscience how bad it really is that you simply don't love people. I think that's what he's saying. So I think to make sense of what he's doing, you really have to read this more as a warning, not a reassurance. There is a reassurance there. If you can look at your life and you see that you truly love people in practical ways, then you know that God is working in your heart and in your life. But if you fail to do that, it's not just your conscience that will condemn you. God is evaluating where our hearts are at. And the heart is the root of the thing. It's not so much what you're doing as what is in your heart and what is motivating you to do it. In fact, you can give, you can help the poor, and still do it for the wrong reasons. Several Old Testament scriptures touch on this same theme of God knowing our hearts and judging the intents of our hearts and so on. Proverbs 15, verse 3. The eyes of the Lord are in every place, keeping watch on the evil and the good. Verse 11. Hell and destruction are before the Lord, So how much more the hearts of the sons of men? Jeremiah 20, verse 12. But, O Lord of hosts, you who test the righteous and see the mind and heart, let me see your vengeance on them, for I have pleaded my cause before you. In the New Testament, scriptures like Hebrews 4 quickly come to mind. Hebrews 4, 12 and 13. For the word of God is living and powerful, and sharper than any two-edged sword, piercing even to the division of soul and spirit, and of joints and marrow, and is a discerner of the thoughts and intents of the heart. And there is no creature hidden from his sight, but all things are naked and open to the eyes of him to whom we must give account. And just as the Apostle John, James, much like him, James, the half-brother of Jesus, presents the need to care for the poor within the church. In James chapter 2, in this passage where he's talking about works and faith and how they relate to each other, James 2, verses 14 through 17 says this: What does it profit, my brethren, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? Can faith save him? In other words, can that kind of faith save him? If a brother or sister is naked and destitute of daily food, and one of you says to them, Depart in peace, be warmed and filled, but you do not give them the things which are needed for the body, what does it profit? Thus also faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. He's not saying we're saved by works. He's saying the faith that saves, it will produce works. A living tree produces fruit. True faith produces works. Works like caring for the poor among the fellowship of believers. In the same way, John would tell us, true love goes beyond mere words to practical demonstrations of one's concern for others. If you truly love someone, you can't watch them be destitute of food and clothing without intervening. This passage gives us three truths about the love command. It points to how the love command is patterned after Jesus' demonstration of incomparable love. There can be no real comparison to the way Jesus demonstrated love. We will never attain to that kind of perfect, self-sacrificial love for others. Never in this life will you attain to that standard. And yet that is the standard. That is the pattern. God calls us to follow Christ, to follow in his footsteps, to show the kind of self-sacrificial love in practical, tangible, concrete ways in response to the needs that we see. So the love command is patterned after Jesus' example. It has to be applied in practical ways. And finally, when we do that, when we fulfill the love command, when we truly love others, that will give us a certain reassurance that we really are God's children, that we are of the truth, that we can have confidence before him, knowing that we're surrendered to him and he's working in our hearts. When our love manifests itself in true love for other people, we know that God is at work in our hearts and we're his children. He's saying something like what he's been saying about love, isn't he? When you love people, you treat them the way Christ would treat them. When you're truly loving someone, you provide for practical needs. Now, we don't know exactly what was going on in John's community, if there was an issue with people not doing this, and that's why he's specifically pointing to this. That very well may be. But in any case, he points us to a general principle that we know is true in every context all the time. We should be aware of the needs of other people around us, and we should love them the way Christ loves them, willing to give of ourselves, give of our time, give of our resources to love them and to meet those needs. Well, let's look to the Lord in prayer as we get ready to close. Father, thank you for your word. Lord, thank you again for this time to come together and to fellowship together through singing, through unpacking your word. God, I pray that you would encourage every heart, Lord, that you would cleanse every heart. God, you know where our hearts are at. Lord, you know what each of us needs, Lord, and you meet us in the place of that need, and we're so grateful for that. Lord, I pray that anyone who has felt conviction from your word at any point, Lord, that you would drive home that point for them in a very real and a practical way. Lord, you know what's needed. Lord, I pray that you would move in our hearts, that you would cleanse our hearts, that you would fill our hearts with love, that you would help us to turn away from sin, to truly love you. Lord, to love you and hate sin, to love you, and because we love you and you first loved us, God, and you've poured your love out in our hearts. Lord, help us to show that love, to demonstrate that love to others in very practical ways. I pray that you would help us have opportunity to do that this week, Lord, that you would help us to show love to others, to show your love through our lives in very real and practical ways, in concrete ways. Lord, I pray that you would just bless each one as we go our separate ways, that you would continue throughout this week to draw us close to you and strengthen our faith in you. And we just thank you and we praise you for it in Jesus' name.